Everyone has started talking about a super El Nino. You've probably seen the word appear in the last few weeks. But here is what almost none of that coverage tells you. The event everyone is discussing has not technically started. The surface of the Pacific still looks close to normal. What has started, what is already physically underway, is happening underwater, in a hidden pool of trapped heat that the surface gives no sign of. The heatwave is not coming. It is forming right now beneath a sea that looks calm, and by the time the surface confesses what the depths already know, the event will be most of the way here. Stay with me, and I will show you the whole machine and how it will affect everyone's lives in the coming months. If this is the kind of story you come here for, subscribe to the Sky Lab and turn on notifications, because we will be tracking this one as it builds. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and whether the seasons have felt off where you live. Let's break this down. Part 1. The heat wave you cannot see. Right now, as you watch this, there is a heat wave happening. It is enormous. It is growing. And you cannot see a single degree of it, because it is not happening in the air. It is happening underwater, roughly 100 meters beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in a place no satellite photograph will ever show you, and no weather report will ever mention. We tend to think of a heat wave as something that happens to us. It is the week the city buckles, the night the air will not cool, the stretch of days when the forecast is just one furious number repeated over and over. A heat wave, in our imagination, is an event of the sky. But the ocean has heat waves too, and the one forming in the Pacific at this moment is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. It is a measurable physical pool of abnormally warm water, vast enough to span a meaningful fraction of the largest ocean on Earth, and it is registering 5 to 6 degrees Celsius above where it should be. That is an extraordinary number for the deep ocean, a body of water that resists temperature change more stubbornly than almost anything else on the planet. To shift it by that much, in that volume, you are not talking about a fluctuation. You are talking about an event. Here is what makes this strange, and here is the reason this video exists. If you were to go out onto the equatorial Pacific today and measure the surface, the very top layer of the ocean where it meets the air, you would find something close to normal. Slightly warm, perhaps, nudging upward. But nothing that would make a scientist drop their coffee. The official index that the world uses to classify these events still reads close to neutral. By the strict formal definition, the thing everyone has started talking about has not technically begun. And yet the supercomputer models, the ones fed by the deep ocean data rather than the surface data, are projecting something that has forecasters genuinely uneasy. They are not projecting a normal event. They are not even projecting a strong one. They are plotting a trajectory towards something that would rank among the most powerful events of its kind in well over a century. The surface whispers, the models scream, and the entire question of this video lives inside that gap. So let me be precise about what we are looking at, because precision is the only thing that separates a real story from a scary one. What is forming in the Pacific is the early stage of what climate scientists call a super El Nino. You have almost certainly heard the term El Nino before. It has drifted into ordinary conversation the way few scientific terms ever do. But I would ask you to set aside whatever you think you know about it for the next couple of hours, because the version of El Nino that lives in popular imagination is a cartoon, and the real thing is far stranger, far larger, and far more consequential than the cartoon suggests. An El Nino is not a storm. It is not a single event with a date and a location. It is a wholesale rearrangement of how heat is distributed across the largest ocean on the planet, and through that ocean, across the entire atmosphere of the Earth. It is, at its core, a transfer of energy, a staggering quantity of stored heat, currently locked inside seawater, preparing to move. And when it moves, it does not stay in the Pacific, it does not stay in the tropics. It reaches up into the high-altitude winds that steer weather across continents, and from there it touches the rain that falls on California, the storms that do or do not form in the Atlantic, the droughts that crack the soil of the Amazon, the fires that race across Australia. One pool of warm water, displaced. A planet's worth of consequences. And I want to be honest with you about why this particular phenomenon deserves your attention more than almost any other single feature of the climate system. The Pacific Ocean is not just one ocean among several. It is the largest single feature on the face of the Earth, larger than every continent combined, a body of water so vast that it spans roughly a third of the entire planet. When the largest feature on Earth rearranges how it stores and releases heat, there is no version of that event that stays local. There cannot be. The Pacific is simply too big a piece of the planet for anything that happens to it to be contained. So, an El Niño is, in a real sense, the planet's single most powerful lever for redistributing heat and moisture on a year-to-year basis. Nothing else in the natural climate system on that timescale comes close. That is why a room full of climate scientists will go quiet when the deep Pacific data starts trending the way it is trending now. They are not watching a regional curiosity. They are watching the largest natural lever on the planet being pulled. I also want to be clear at the very start about what this video is and is not. This is not a forecast. I am not going to tell you the weather for a specific day in a specific town, because nobody honestly can, and a channel that pretends otherwise is not worth your time. What this is instead is an explanation of a machine. By the time we are finished, you will understand the physical system well enough that when you see the headlines arrive over the coming months, when you see the word El Niño appear and then the word super attached to it, you will not be a spectator to that news. You will understand the engine underneath it. You will know what the surface is hiding, why the models are saying what they are saying, and what each stage of the unfolding event actually means. That understanding is the thing I am actually here to give you. The drama in this story is real, but it is not the point. The point is that you walk away able to read the machine yourself. That is the claim. Over the next 2 hours, I am going to walk you through every link in that chain, slowly and carefully, until the whole machine is laid out in front of you and you can see exactly how a change you cannot see becomes a change you cannot escape. But first I want to stay with the strangeness of the present moment, because it matters. We're used to a particular relationship with weather and climate news. Something happens, and then we hear about it. The storm makes landfall, and then the coverage begins. The heatwave arrives, and then the forecasters explain it. Cause, then effect, then explanation, in that comfortable order. What is happening in the Pacific right now breaks that order completely. The cause is already here. The warm water is already pooled. The deep wave that will carry it is already in motion. The effect simply has not surfaced yet. We are, in a very literal sense, living inside the gap between a cause and its consequences, watching the fuse burn before the thing it is connected to has gone off. And the reason almost nobody feels that, the reason it does not dominate every news cycle the way an approaching hurricane would, is simply that it is invisible. It is 100 meters down. The ocean has hidden it. If this same quantity of excess heat were sitting in the atmosphere instead of the sea, if it were a heat dome parked over a continent, there would be wall-to-wall coverage, emergency briefings, the entire apparatus of public attention swinging toward it. But because it is underwater, because the surface still looks calm, it gets the quiet treatment. A pool of trapped heat the size of a story that should be on every front page, sitting silently beneath a sea that looks, from above, like an ordinary sea. Think about what it actually takes to warm water. You have felt this yourself, every time you have waited for a pot to boil, or stepped into an ocean that stayed cold long after the air turned hot. Water is thermally stubborn. It takes an enormous amount of energy to raise its temperature, far more than it takes to warm an equivalent volume of air. That stubbornness is exactly why the ocean is the planet's great heat reservoir, the flywheel that smooths out the wild swings the atmosphere would otherwise throw at us. So when you are told that a vast volume of deep Pacific water is running 5 to 6 degrees above normal, you should not hear that as a small number. You should hear it as evidence of a colossal amount of energy that has been poured into a place that does not give up its heat easily. Something filled that reservoir, and a full reservoir, by its nature, is a reservoir waiting to empty. I want to give you a way to feel that stubbornness, because it is the single physical property that the whole rest of this video depends on. Imagine 2 identical rooms. In one, you place a heater and let it run for an hour into the open air. In the other, you place the same heater under a swimming pool's worth of water. After that hour, the air in the first room is uncomfortably hot. The water in the second room is barely changed, a fraction of a degree, perhaps not even measurable without good instruments. Same heater, same hour, wildly different result. That is not a trick. That is the physics of what scientists call heat capacity, and water has one of the highest heat capacities of any common substance on Earth. It drinks energy and shows almost nothing for it. Now run the thought experiment backwards. If it took that much energy to warm the water even slightly, then a body of water that has genuinely, measurably warmed by 5 or 6 degrees has absorbed a quantity of energy that would have set the air on fire, figuratively speaking. The ocean does not advertise its heat, it conceals it. The calm of that Pacific surface is not the absence of energy. It is water doing exactly what water does, holding a fortune in heat without so much as a visible ripple to show for it. And this is why the ocean, not the atmosphere, is the part of the climate system that the serious scientists watch most closely. The atmosphere is loud and fast and dramatic. It produces the storms and the heat waves and the headlines. But the atmosphere is also thin and flighty, and it has very little memory. It changes its mind in days. The ocean is the opposite. It is deep and slow, and it remembers. Heat that goes into the deep ocean can stay there for months, for years, for decades, quietly held before it is released again. So when something is loading the deep Pacific with heat right now, that is not a passing mood of the climate system. That is the system's long memory being written, and the models that are alarmed precisely because they are not reading the atmosphere's short temper. They are reading the ocean's long memory, and the long memory is telling them something is coming. This is the part of the story that the calm surface conceals, and it is the part you most need to understand. The event is not in the future. The energy is already in the bank. What we are waiting on is not the arrival of the heat, it is the surfacing of it. The models are not guessing whether the heat exists. They can see it. They are projecting how violently it will come up, how far east it will travel, and how completely it will rewrite the weather of the year ahead once it does. There is a second reason this story sits so strangely with us, beyond the simple fact of its being underwater, and it is worth naming directly. We are pattern-matching creatures. We understand the world through stories that have a shape, a beginning and a middle and an end, a moment when the thing happens. A hurricane has that shape. It forms, it is named, it approaches, it makes landfall, it is over. An earthquake has that shape compressed into seconds. Even a long drought has the shape of a slow worsening that we can at least narrate. But a forming El Niño refuses to have that shape. There is no single moment when it happens. There is no landfall, there is no clean before and after. It is a slow, distributed, continuous reorganization of an ocean, and our minds, built for sharper stories, struggle to hold it. We are, in a sense, not equipped to be appropriately alarmed by something this shapeless, and that cognitive blind spot is part of why a story this large gets the quiet treatment. It is not only hidden in the water, it is hidden in the kind of story it is. I dwell on this because I think it is the honest reason that a developing Super El Niño does not feel as urgent to most people as it actually is. It is not that the information is secret. The buoy data is public. The model projections are published. Anyone can look. It is that the thing does not arrive with the dramatic punctuation our attention is tuned to. It seeps, and a story that seeps, no matter how large, tends to lose the competition for our attention to a story that strikes. So part of what I am trying to do, across the next 2 hours, is simply to give this seeping, shapeless, invisible thing a shape you can hold, so that it can occupy the space in your attention that its actual size deserves. So here is the question I want you to carry with you, the thread that every part of this video hangs from. If the surface of the Pacific looks nearly normal today, and the official number still says we have not crossed the line, then how can the models be so alarmed? What exactly are they seeing that the surface is hiding? And if the engine of this thing is already running, already loaded, already moving beneath a sea that gives no sign of it, then the only thing left to wonder is this. What does the world look like on the day all of that hidden heat finally reaches the air? Part 2. The machine that runs the Pacific. To understand what is breaking, you first have to understand what it looks like when nothing is broken at all. So let me take you to the normal Pacific. The ordinary, well-behaved, business-as-usual Pacific that has been running more or less the same way for as long as there have been people to notice it. The story begins with wind. Not dramatic wind, not storm wind, but something far more relentless and far more important. The Earth, because it is a spinning sphere heated unevenly by the sun, generates great standing patterns of air, vast circulation systems that wrap around the planet. Out over the tropical Pacific, one consequence of those systems is a steady, patient river of air called the trade winds. And the trade winds, over that ocean, blow in a consistent direction. They blow from east to west, from the coast of South America out across thousands of miles of open water toward Indonesia and Australia on the far side. These winds are not violent. If you stood on a beach in that part of the world, you would simply feel a pleasant, persistent breeze, the kind you would stop noticing within an hour. But persistence is the entire point. The trade winds almost never stop. Day after day, month after month, year after year, they push in the same direction, and when you push on the surface of an ocean, steadily, for years, the ocean responds. The water moves. The wind, dragging across the top of the sea, physically pushes the warm surface water westward, the same direction the wind itself is travelling. Now follow that water. It starts near South America, it gets pushed west, and it does not simply vanish when it reaches the other side of the ocean. It piles up. Over years and decades, this constant westward shove accumulates an immense quantity of warm surface water in the Western Pacific, in the Great Basin near Indonesia and Australia. Picture it as a hill. Not a hill of land, but a hill of warm water, gently but genuinely higher and dramatically warmer than the eastern side of the same ocean. The sea level on the western side of the Pacific actually sits measurably higher than the sea level on the eastern side, held up there by nothing but the patient pressure of the wind. This is sometimes called the Western Pacific Warm Pool, and it is one of the largest reservoirs of warm water anywhere on Earth. It is the bank vault, remember it. Everything in this story eventually comes back to that vault. But pushing water away from one place means something has to take its place. This is where the second half of the machine comes in, and it is, in my opinion, the most quietly beautiful part of the whole system. As the warm surface water is continually dragged away from the coast of South America, water has to come from somewhere to replace it, and the only place it can come from is below. Cold water from the deep ocean rises up toward the surface along the South American coast to fill the space the departing warm water leaves behind. Scientists call this process upwelling, and that word upwelling deserves a moment of your attention, because what it describes is genuinely one of the engines of life on this planet. The deep ocean is dark and cold, but it is not empty. Over centuries, organic material drifts down from the sunlit surface into the depths, and as it decays, it loads the deep water with nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and the chemical building blocks that life is hungry for. The surface ocean, by contrast, is often nutrient poor, because life up there has already consumed what was available. So when upwelling lifts that cold, deep, nutrient-rich water up to the sunlit surface off the coast of Peru and Ecuador, it is doing something extraordinary. It is fertilizing the sea. It is bringing the food of the depths up into the light where photosynthesis can happen. The result is one of the most biologically dense and productive marine ecosystems anywhere on the planet. The cold upwelling waters off South America explode with microscopic plant life, and that plant life feeds vast schools of small fish, and those fish feed larger fish, and seabirds and marine mammals, and for centuries entire human economies. Fishing communities along that coast have been built, generation after generation, on the simple, reliable fact that the cold water keeps rising and the cold water keeps bringing food. They did not need to understand the trade winds or the warm pool or the physics of any of it. They only needed the pattern to hold, and for most years it does. I want to slow down on this upwelling for a moment longer, because there is a detail here that most people never hear, and it changes how you see the whole system. That narrow strip of cold, productive water off the coast of Peru, just a sliver of the vast Pacific, punches so far above its weight that it has, in some years, supplied a genuinely outsized share of the entire world's fish catch. A thin coastal ribbon, fed by water rising from the dark, feeding a meaningful fraction of the planet. That is not a quaint local fishery. That is a load-bearing pillar of the global food supply, and it stands on one thing and one thing only, the continued rising of cold water. The upwelling is not a nice feature of that coast. It is the foundation under millions of livelihoods and a real piece of the world's protein. Hold that, because when we return to South America later in this video, and we watch the warm water arrive and cap that upwelling shut, you will understand that what is being switched off is not a curiosity, it is a pillar. And notice the elegance of what nature has built here, because it really is a kind of machine, and machines have a logic. The wind does the work of moving the warm water away. The act of moving the warm water away creates the space. The space draws up the cold water carries the nutrients feed the life. Every step is the cause of the next step. Pull any single link and the whole chain reorganizes. It is a system in the truest sense, not a pile of separate facts, but a connected loop where everything depends on everything else. The trade winds, the warm pool, the upwelling, the fishery, they are not four things. They are one thing, one machine, viewed from four angles. So that is the normal Pacific, the whole machine in its resting state. Trade winds blow steadily east to west. Warm water piles up in the western Pacific, in the Great Warm Pool near Indonesia. Cold, nutrient-rich water rises along the South American coast to replace what the wind has carried away. The west is warm and stormy and wet, the home of some of the most reliable rainfall on Earth. The east is cooler and drier, its coastline fed by that upwelling abundance. It is a balanced system, a loop that feeds itself, and it has a kind of machinery to it that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. But I want you to notice something about this machine, because it is the crack that the rest of this story pours through. The entire balanced arrangement depends on one thing. It depends on the wind continuing to push. The warm pool is not held in the Western Pacific by a wall. There is no barrier keeping it there. It is held there by force, by the steady, ongoing pressure of the trade winds, the way you might hold a heavy door shut by leaning your shoulder against it. The water is piled up against the western edge of the ocean, and it stays piled up only because something is actively holding it. The system looks stable, it looks permanent, it has the calm, settled appearance of something that will simply always be this way. It is not. It is a balance held in place by an effort, and the moment that effort falters, the balance is free to collapse. The warm pool, that vast hill of stored heat in the Western Pacific, is not a fixture. It is a held breath, and a held breath sooner or later gets released. There is one more feature of this machine I have to give you before we watch it break, because without it the rest of the story does not fully make sense. I have described the warm pool as a hill of warm water on the surface, and that is true, but the warmth is not only a surface feature. Underneath that piled up warm water in the Western Pacific, the layer of warm water extends downward, deep, far deeper than it does on the eastern side of the ocean. Picture the boundary between the warm surface water and the cold, deep water as a kind of internal ceiling within the ocean, an invisible floor under the warmth. Scientists call that boundary the thermocline, and the trade winds, by piling warm water against the west, push that boundary down deep on the western side and let it rise up shallow on the eastern side. The thermocline is tilted. It runs deep near Indonesia and shallow near Peru, like a ramp sloping through the body of the ocean. That tilt matters enormously, and here is why. On the eastern side, near South America, the cold water is close to the surface. The thermocline is shallow, which is exactly what allows the upwelling to reach the top so easily. The cold is right there, just below. But it also means the eastern Pacific is primed. The instant the wind weakens and that tilted thermocline tries to level out, the deep warm water that was held down in the west comes flooding toward the east, not only across the surface, but through the body of the ocean, riding along that internal boundary. The tilt of the thermocline is the loaded spring inside the machine. The trade winds cock the spring by holding the tilt in place, and the moment the wind eases, the spring releases, and the whole tilted structure begins to lurch back toward level. That lurch is the event. That lurch is what we are about to watch. So what happens when the wind stops leaning on the door? Part 3. When the wind lets go. Periodically, and not on any schedule we can perfectly predict, the trade winds weaken. This is the trigger. This is the single event from which everything else in this story unspools. The relentless east to west push across the Pacific falters, slackens, in some episodes nearly stops. And in some cases the winds do something even more dramatic than weakening. In short, intense bursts, patches of wind along the equator actually reverse and begin blowing the other way from west to east, shoving in the opposite direction from their usual habit. The cause of that weakening is itself a deep and partly unsolved question, a feedback loop between ocean and atmosphere where it becomes genuinely difficult to say which partner leads the dance. But for our purposes, what matters is not the why of the weakening. What matters is the consequence. Because remember what the trade winds were doing. They were the shoulder against the door, they were the force, and only the force, holding that enormous hill of warm water piled against the western edge of the Pacific. Take the force away, and you're left with a vast mass of water sitting higher than the water beside it, with nothing holding it in place. And there is one thing in this universe that never weakens, never takes a break, never slackens its grip: gravity. The instant the wind stops holding that warm pool in place, gravity takes over the job of moving it. Water cannot stay piled into a hill on its own. It flows. It seeks its level. And so that immense reservoir of warm water, built up over years in the Western Pacific, begins to flow back. It begins to move eastward, back across the ocean it was so slowly carried away from, sliding towards South America. This is the moment the heat wave you cannot see begins its journey. And I want to be careful and clear about how it travels, because this is the most misunderstood part of the entire phenomenon, and it is the key to everything we discussed in the first part of this video. The warm water does not simply slosh across the surface like water, tipping in a bathtub in plain view where anyone with a thermometer could track it. A great deal of it travels as a wave, but not a wave on the surface, a wave that moves through the body of the ocean itself deep below the top layer, a pulse of warm water propagating eastward along the equator, hidden under the skin of the sea. These deep waves are real, they are tracked, and they are the physical engine of the thing the models are watching. A pulse of warm water, gliding eastward beneath the surface, carrying the heat of the Western Pacific toward the Americas, while the surface above it gives almost nothing away. This is why, in the first part of this video, I kept returning to the gap between what the surface shows and what the depths contain. Now you can see exactly why that gap exists. The heat is moving. It is genuinely, measurably on its way. But for much of its journey it travels underground, so to speak, beneath the waterline, and the surface is simply the last thing to feel it arrive. The deep ocean has already committed. The surface has not yet confessed. And there is something genuinely strange and worth pausing on about these deep waves, because they behave in a way that defies our everyday intuition about water. When you think of a wave, you think of the ocean's surface, of something you can see and that moves at a speed you can roughly imagine. These waves are different. They travel along that internal boundary we discussed, the thermocline, the buried ceiling between warm and cold water, and because they travel within the body of the ocean rather than on its skin, they move slowly, on the scale of weeks and months to cross the Pacific, and they are enormous in a dimension you cannot see, displacing that internal boundary up or down by tens of meters as they pass. An observer on a ship directly above one of these waves would notice nothing at all. The sea would look like the sea, and yet beneath that ship a wave the height of a building, in terms of how far it lifts the internal layers of the ocean, would be sliding past, carrying the heat of half an ocean toward another continent. The Pacific is, in this sense, doing something colossal in a register we're simply not built to perceive. The drama is real, it is just pitched below the frequency of human senses. This is also the part of the story where the relationship between the ocean and the atmosphere becomes a genuine loop rather than a one-way street, and I want to be honest with you about the complexity here, because it is one of the things that makes these events hard to forecast. The weakening of the trade winds lets the warm water move east, but as the warm water moves east and surfaces, it warms the air above it, and that warming of the air in the central Pacific itself further weakens the trade winds, because the winds are driven by the temperature contrast across the ocean, and the moving warm water is erasing that contrast. So the weakening wind moves the warm water, and the moved warm water weakens the wind. Each one feeds the other. It is a self-reinforcing loop, and once it gets going with enough strength, it can run away with itself, building on its own momentum. That runaway quality is exactly what turns an ordinary, modest El Niño into a giant one. The system, past a certain point, stops needing an external push. It begins pushing itself, and then the warm water reaches the eastern side of the ocean, and it arrives at the coast of South America, and here the system delivers its decisive blow. Picture what is normally happening there: cold water rising, upwelling, lifting nutrients and life toward the light. Now picture this enormous mass of warm water arriving from the west and settling over the top of that region like a lid, like a thick warm cap pressed down over the cold upwelling, and it shuts the upwelling down. The cold water can no longer break through to the surface. The lid is too thick, too warm, too buoyant. The fountain of cold, nutrient-rich water that fed that entire ecosystem is in effect switched off. The consequences for the sea life there are immediate and they are severe, and we will return to them later, because the human story along that coast is one of the oldest and most painful chapters of this whole phenomenon. In fact, this is where the name itself comes from. fishing communities along the coast of Peru and Ecuador noticed centuries ago that this warm water arrival, this collapse of their fishery, tended to show up around Christmas, and so they named it El Niño, a reference to the Christ child, to the timing of it, around the Christmas season. The name is gentle, the thing it describes is not. There is something almost poignant in that origin, and it tells you how long humans have been living at the mercy of this phenomenon without understanding it. For most of human history, the people who felt El Niño most directly, the fishing families of that coast, had no concept of trade winds spanning an entire ocean, no concept of a warm pool piled up near Indonesia, no satellites, no buoys, no models. They had only the lived generational experience of a sea that, every few years, would inexplicably turn warm and empty around the holiday season. They named the mystery before anyone could explain it. And what is striking is that the entire vast machinery this video has been describing, the planet-spanning system of winds and waves and reservoirs of heat, was, for those communities, simply a single observable fact: the year the fish did not come at Christmas. It took modern science centuries to work backward from that one local observation to the global engine behind it. We are, in a real sense, still completing that work right now, with the instruments in the water, watching the same phenomenon those fishing families named, finally able to see the whole of it. But the shutdown of the upwelling, dramatic as it is not the climax of the story. It is the doorway to the climax. Because now think about what is sitting on the surface of the Eastern Pacific. A vast expanse of warm water, exposed, spread out under the tropical sun, no longer being cooled from below by the cold upwelling that used to moderate it. The surface temperature of the Eastern and Central Pacific spikes. The ocean heat wave has, at last, surfaced. The thing that was hidden at 100 meters depth is now lying across the top of the sea, and it is in direct contact with the atmosphere, and that contact is the entire point. That is the hinge on which the global half of this story turns. Because heat in the ocean, by itself, does not change the weather over Kansas or California or the Amazon. Heat in the ocean is just warm water. But heat that has risen to the surface and is now in contact with the air begins to do what heat always does at a boundary. It transfers. The warm ocean surface radiates its heat upward into the atmosphere, and it does something else that is just as important. It pumps moisture upward, because warm water evaporates faster, and warm, moisture-laden air is buoyant air, rising air, the raw fuel of clouds and storms and rainfall, and here is the part that turns a warm patch of ocean into a planet-scale event. Where the warm water surfaces, the air rises, and that rising is not a small or local thing. It becomes a vast zone of ascending air over the Central and Eastern Pacific, a chimney, drawing air up and out. But the atmosphere is a closed system. Air that rises in one place must come back down somewhere else, and air that is drawn toward the chimney must be replaced by air flowing in from elsewhere. So the appearance of this great rising zone over the Central Pacific does not just make it rainy over the Central Pacific. It reorganizes the entire pattern of rising and sinking air across the whole tropical belt of the planet. The places that used to have the rising air now have sinking air, and sinking air is dry, stable, rainless air. The places that used to be dry may now sit under rising air. The whole map of where the planet's air goes up and where it comes down gets redrawn. That is the mechanism. That is, in a single image, how a warm pool in one ocean rewrites the rainfall of continents. It moves the chimney, and when the chimney moves, everything downstream of the chimney moves with it. So the warm pool, having crossed the ocean as a hidden wave, having capped the upwelling and surfaced into the sunlight, now becomes a vast engine venting heat and moisture into the sky above the Central and Eastern Pacific. And that is no longer an ocean event. The moment that heat and that moisture are airborne, they are the atmosphere's problem, and the atmosphere does not respect borders. The energy gets picked up by the great circulation systems of the planet, the high-altitude winds, the jet streams, the standing waves of air that steer weather across whole continents. The heat wave that began its life invisible, 100 meters beneath the Pacific, has now boarded the global circulation, and it is about to be carried everywhere. We have, in these three parts, followed the heat from its hiding place to its release. We have watched the wind let go of the door, watched gravity take the warm water back across the ocean, watched it cap the cold upwelling and surface into the sun, and hand its energy to the sky. The engine is running. The transfer has begun. But we have not yet asked the question that the supercomputer models exist to answer. The question that separates an ordinary El Niño from the kind that earns a darker name. We know the heat is moving. We know it is surfacing. The thing we have not measured yet is how much of it there is. So how big is this one really? And how do we put a number on a heat wave hiding inside an ocean? Part 4. How to measure a heat wave. Hiding in an ocean. Every El Niño is, in a sense, the same event. The trades weaken, the warm pool slides east, the upwelling caps, the heat surfaces. The mechanism does not change. What changes dramatically from one event to the next is the magnitude. Some El Niño events are mild, barely worth a headline, a slight nudge to a season's weather. Others reorganize the climate of the entire planet for a year and leave scars that take far longer to heal. And if you want to understand why scientists are uneasy about the one forming right now, you have to understand how they tell those two kinds apart. You have to understand how they measure it. The tool they use is an index. Strip away the technical language and the idea behind it is simple enough to hold in one hand. To measure an El Niño, you pick a defined region of the central and eastern Pacific, a specific rectangle of ocean that sits right in the path of the surfacing warm water. And you do one thing. You track how much warmer the surface of the water in that region is compared to the long-term average for that same patch of sea. That is it. That is the whole instrument. Not the absolute temperature, but the departure from normal. The anomaly. How far the ocean has strayed from its own long-term behavior. If that rectangle of Pacific is running 0.5 degree Celsius above its average, that is a small anomaly, the system barely leaning. If it is running a full degree above average, now you have a genuine, classifiable El Niño underway, and the scale climbs from there. When that patch of ocean reaches roughly 1.5 degrees Celsius above its long-term average, scientists classify the event as a strong El Niño. That is already a serious event, already enough to bend a hurricane season and reroute the rains across continents. But there is a threshold beyond strong. There is a line where the language changes, where the people who study this for a living reach for a different and heavier word. When the anomaly in that region climbs to 2 full degrees Celsius above average, or higher, the event crosses into what is informally called a super El Niño, 2 degrees. Hold on to that number, because it is the line, the border between an event that is merely strong and an event that belongs in the small, infamous club of the strongest the modern record has ever produced. Before we go further, I want to address something about that index, because it is the source of a great deal of public confusion, and you have probably felt the confusion yourself. People will hear, in the same week, one report saying a super El Niño is developing, and another report saying conditions are still officially neutral, and they will conclude reasonably that the experts cannot make up their minds. But that is not what is happening. The index is a measurement of the surface, of conditions as they are right now, today, on the top layer of that patch of ocean, and the surface, as we have spent this whole video establishing, lags behind the deep ocean. So it is entirely possible, and in fact it is exactly the present situation, for the index to read close to neutral while a giant event is already loading underneath it. The two reports are not contradicting each other. One is describing the surface now, the other is describing where the deep ocean data says the surface is heading. Once you understand that the index measures the present surface and the models read the loaded depths, the apparent contradiction dissolves. It was never a disagreement. It was two honest answers to two different questions. Now, 2 degrees Celsius. I want to be honest with you about that number, because on its own it does not sound frightening. 2 degrees is the difference between a comfortable room and a slightly warmer comfortable room. If your home changed by 2 degrees overnight, you might not even wake up. So why should 2 degrees of ocean anomaly spread across a patch of the Pacific be a thing the world braces for? The answer is the one we built carefully back in the first part of this video, and now it pays off. Water is thermally stubborn. It takes a colossal amount of energy to move the temperature of a large volume of ocean even a little. So when you are told that a vast region of the Pacific surface is running 2 degrees, or 3 degrees, above its long-term average, you're not being told about a small change. You're being told about an almost unimaginable quantity of heat energy, because that is what it costs to push that much water that far. The number on the index is small. The energy the number represents is not. The index is a thermometer reading on the outside of a furnace. 2 degrees on the dial means the furnace inside is roaring. So let us put real events against that scale, because abstract thresholds mean nothing without memory attached to them. In recent meteorological history, 2 El Niño events stand above all the others, 2 events that scientists still use as the reference points, the measuring sticks, for what a giant El Niño can do. One occurred in 1997, the other occurred in 2015. Both were monsters. Both were super El Niño events, both well past that 2-degree line. The 2015 event in particular was extraordinary, peaking at roughly 2¾ degrees Celsius above normal, 2.75 degrees. That was, by the standards of the modern record, about as extreme as these events were thought to get. The 2015 event rerouted rainfall across the planet, fed punishing droughts, drove a global spike in temperature, and left a mark that scientists studied for years afterward. When climate scientists wanted to picture the upper bound of an El Niño, the worst end of the realistic range, 2015, was very often the picture they reached for. It is worth pausing on what those 2 events actually did, because they are not abstractions, they are lived history within the memory of most people watching this. The 1997 event reorganized weather across continents, drove flooding and drought on opposite sides of the planet simultaneously, and was, at the time, one of the most studied climate events in history. And then 2015 came along and, by the index, edged past it. The 2015 event coincided with a global temperature record, with severe drought stress across parts of the tropics, with coral reefs bleaching as warm water overwhelmed them, with disrupted growing seasons and shifted rainfall on multiple continents. These were not quiet years. They were the years that the textbooks now use to define what the upper end of this phenomenon looks like. They were, for a generation of climate scientists, the ceiling. And that word, ceiling, is exactly the word I need you to hold. Because the unease in the current forecast is fundamentally an unease about a ceiling being exceeded. When the model guidance for late 2026 plots a path beyond 3 degrees, it is not saying this event will be a little worse than an average year. It is saying this event is projected to climb past 2015, past the very events that scientists had been using as their working definition of the worst realistic case. It is a forecast that does not fit inside the existing frame of reference. And that is a genuinely uncomfortable position for any science to be in, because it means the most extreme events in the reliable record may no longer be the measuring stick. They may simply be the previous record, about to be passed. And here, finally, is the reason for the unease. Here is why this video exists and why forecasters are watching the Pacific the way they are. Multiple climate models running the deep ocean data forward toward late 2026 are not plotting a path toward a normal El Niño. They are not even plotting a path toward a repeat of 2015. They are plotting a trajectory that climbs past 3 degrees Celsius above normal, past 3, beyond the 2015 monster, beyond 2.75, into a range that, if those projections hold, would rank this event as the strongest El Niño since records of this kind began, stretching back to the late 1800s. The strongest in well over a century. Not the strongest in a decade, not the strongest in a generation. The strongest since before the invention of the automobile. Now, the honest scientist in me has to stop you here, and I want to do this carefully, because intellectual honesty is the whole foundation this channel is built on. That 3-degree figure is a projection. It is a model output. It is the product of supercomputers running the physics forward in time, and any forecast that reaches months into the future carries real uncertainty. The atmosphere is, in certain ways, genuinely hard to predict, and there is a particular stretch of the calendar, in the spring of the year, when ENSO forecasts have historically been at their shakiest. Forecasts made in that window have, in past years, called for big events that then arrived smaller than promised, or fizzled. So I am not going to stand here and tell you that 3 degrees is locked in. It is not. It could come in lower. It could, and this is the part that should genuinely sober you, also come in higher. That spring stretch of weak forecast skill even has a name among the people who do this work. They call it the spring predictability barrier, and the reason it exists is genuinely interesting and worth a moment of your time. In the spring, the ocean atmosphere system of the tropical Pacific tends to be in a kind of transitional, undecided state, the old pattern fading and a new one not yet firmly established. A forecast is only as good as the signal it has to work with, and in spring the signal is at its faintest, the system at its most genuinely poised between outcomes. So a forecast launched in spring is launched across the foggiest part of the year. That is the honest caveat, and I am giving it to you plainly. But notice, and this matters, that the spring barrier is a statement about predicting the surface evolution. It is not a statement that erases the subsurface measurement. The fog is around exactly how high the index will climb and exactly when. The fog is not around whether the warm pool exists. We can see the warm pool. The barrier makes the precise peak uncertain. It does not make the loaded engine uncertain. Keep those two separate and you will think about this far more clearly than most of the coverage you will encounter. But here is what is not a projection. Here is what is not a model guess. The warm water beneath the Pacific right now is real, and it is measured. We talked about it in the very first minutes of this video, and now I can tell you exactly how we know. Scattered across the equatorial Pacific is a network of ocean instruments, buoys, that do not only measure the surface. They reach down. They take the temperature of the water at depth, including down around that 100-meter level. And those instruments are reporting right now that vast pool of subsurface water running 5 to 6 degrees Celsius above normal. I want you to appreciate what that network of buoys actually represents, because it is one of the quiet triumphs of modern science, and most people have never heard of it. Strung across the equatorial Pacific, anchored to the seafloor in water miles deep, is a line of instrumented buoys whose entire purpose is to take the temperature of the ocean, not just at the surface but down through the water column, and to do it continuously, and to radio that data back so that scientists and forecasters can watch the deep ocean in something close to real time. Before that network existed, the deep state of the Pacific was very nearly invisible to us. An El Niño could be loading itself for months and the warning would be faint. Now, there is a tripwire. Now, the hidden heatwave we've been discussing is not actually hidden from the instruments, only from the casual eye. The buoys feel it. And what the buoys are feeling right now, at depth, is that anomalous warm pool, 5 to 6 degrees above where it should be. That is the measurement. That is the ground truth underneath every model projection in this story. So understand the precise division of labour here, because it is the key to thinking clearly about this entire subject. There are two different kinds of statement in the forecast, and they deserve two different levels of confidence. The first kind is a measurement. The subsurface warm pool exists. It is this large, it is this warm, and it is moving east. That is observed. That is the buoys. You can hold that with both hands. The second kind is a projection. The event will peak at such and such a magnitude in late 2026. The index will climb past 3 degrees. That is a model output, a calculation running the observed conditions forward through the physics, and it carries the uncertainty that any forward calculation carries. The mistake people make, in both directions, is collapsing those two kinds of statement into one. The panicked reader treats the 3-degree projection as a measured certainty. The dismissive reader treats the whole thing, warm pool included, as just models being dramatic. Both are wrong, and they are wrong in the same way, by refusing to separate what is measured from what is projected. The disciplined view holds both at once. The engine is measured. The size of the eventual bang is projected. Respect each for what it is. That is not a model. That is not a projection of what might happen. That is a measurement of what already physically exists. The fuel is in the tank. The instruments can feel it. The only thing the models are doing is taking that measured, observed, undeniable subsurface heat and calculating how violently it will surface, how far east it will spread, and how high the index will climb when it does. They are not inventing the heat. They are reading a loaded gun and estimating the size of the bang. There is one more thing the index cannot do, and it is worth stating because it bears directly on how you should read the news over the months ahead. The index is a single number. It compresses the entire state of a vast ocean into one figure, and a single figure by its nature throws away detail. Two El Niño events could, in principle, register the same number on the index and still behave quite differently, because the warm water could be distributed differently across the Pacific, concentrated more toward the Central Ocean in one case, and more toward the Eastern Ocean in another, and that distribution genuinely changes how the event projects onto the global atmosphere. So the index is the headline, and the headline is useful, but the headline is not the whole story. When you hear a number reported over the coming months, understand that it is a summary, a single distilled figure standing in for an ocean's worth of structure. The number tells you the magnitude. It does not tell you every nuance of the character. Both will matter for what the event ultimately does, and this returns us, with the whole machine now visible, to the central mystery of this video. The surface of the Pacific today looks close to normal. The official index has not yet crossed the line that would let anyone formally announce that a Super El Nino has arrived. By the strict definition, we are still in the waiting room. And yet the deep ocean is carrying a measured heat anomaly of 5 to 6 degrees, and the models fed by that data are projecting an event beyond anything in well over 100 years. That is the gap, the calm surface and the screaming forecast. And the gap is not a contradiction, it is not an error, it is simply the signature of a heat wave that has not finished rising yet. The surface is calm because the heat is still on its way up. And the single most important thing to understand about this entire phenomenon is that by the time the surface stops being calm, by the time the index officially crosses the line and the announcement is finally made, the event will not be beginning. It will already be most of the way here. The announcement will be a confirmation, not a warning. I want to make that point land as hard as it deserves, because it inverts the way we're used to receiving this kind of news. With most hazards, the announcement comes first and the event comes after, and the gap between them is your warning time, your chance to prepare. A storm is named, and then it arrives. With a forming Super El Nino, the order is reversed. The event is already underway, physically, in the deep ocean, and the formal announcement, the moment the index crosses the line and the headlines turn certain, comes late, after the engine has been running for months. So if you wait for the official confirmation before you take the thing seriously, you will not be early. You will be among the last to know, reacting to a press release about a machine that has already been turning for half a year. The only way to be genuinely early on an event like this is to do exactly what you're doing right now, which is to understand the engine before the announcement, to read the subsurface data and the physics rather than waiting for the headline. The calm surface is not telling you there is time, it is telling you the heat has not surfaced yet. Those are very different messages, and mistaking one for the other is the single most common error people make about this phenomenon. So the heat is loaded, the magnitude is potentially historic, and the engine has begun handing its energy to the atmosphere. From this point on, the story leaves the ocean. From this point on, we follow the heat into the sky, and we ask where the global circulation carries it first. And the answer, the place the world will most likely see the first clear fingerprint of this forming giant, is not where most people would guess. It is in the Atlantic. It is in the hurricanes. Part 5. The first place. The world will see it. If you wanted to know whether a Super El Nino was truly taking hold, you might think to watch the Pacific itself, but the Pacific, as we have seen, is good at hiding things. The place the rest of the world is far more likely to see the first unmistakable fingerprint of this forming event is thousands of miles away, in an entirely different ocean. It is in the Atlantic, and it will show up in the form of a hurricane season that behaves strangely. To understand why an event in the Pacific reaches across 2 continents, to touch storms in the Atlantic, we need to follow that airborne heat we left rising off the Pacific surface at the end of Part 3. Remember where we left it. The warm pool had surfaced, it was venting heat and moisture into the sky, and that energy had been picked up by the global circulation. Now we trace where the circulation carries it. When the central and eastern Pacific runs this hot, it supercharges the rising motion of air above it, and that disturbance ripples downwind. It generates strong winds high up in the atmosphere, winds that travel eastward, sweeping across Central America and out over the tropical Atlantic, the exact stretch of ocean where Atlantic hurricanes are born. And those high-altitude winds do something specific to a developing storm. To explain it, I need to explain what a hurricane actually needs in order to grow, because the popular image of a hurricane gets one thing badly wrong. We tend to picture a hurricane as pure chaos, pure violence, a swirling mess of destruction. But a hurricane is not chaos. A hurricane is the opposite of chaos. It is an exquisitely organized machine, a tall, coherent, vertically stacked engine that reaches from the warm ocean surface all the way up to the high atmosphere. A hurricane is, in a sense, a tower. A storm becomes a hurricane precisely by getting itself organized, by stacking its structure neatly upward into that coherent column. And a tower has a weakness. A tower can be knocked over. The thing that knocks it over is called wind shear. Wind shear is what you have when the wind at a low altitude is blowing in one direction or at one speed, and the wind high above it is blowing in a different direction or at a very different speed. When that happens, the atmosphere is, in effect, sliding past itself at different levels, and a young storm trying to build its tall, neat, vertical tower in an atmosphere full of wind shear is like trying to stack chairs to the ceiling in a room where the floor and the ceiling are moving in opposite directions. The shear catches the top of the growing storm and shoves it sideways, away from the bottom. It tilts the tower. It tears the structure apart before it can ever finish building itself. It decapitates the storm. And there is a deeper reason wind shear is so lethal to a hurricane, beyond simply tilting it, and it is worth understanding because it shows you just how delicate these giant storms actually are. A hurricane runs on a very particular trick. Warm, moist air rises in the core of the storm, and as that air rises and its moisture condenses into cloud and rain, it releases heat, and that released heat is the fuel that drives the whole engine, that lowers the pressure at the centre and pulls in more warm air to rise and release more heat. It is a loop, and the loop only works if the heat stays concentrated in the core, stacked vertically, feeding back on itself. Wind shear breaks the loop. By tilting the storm and sliding its upper levels away from its lower levels, the shear smears that concentrated heat across a wider area, ventilates the core, lets the warmth escape sideways instead of building upward. The storm is not just knocked over, it is in effect having its fuel line cut. So an El Niño, by filling the Atlantic with shear, is not merely making the basin untidy for hurricanes. It is reaching into the most fundamental mechanism a hurricane has and quietly disconnecting it. So now connect the two halves. The forming Super El Niño, venting its heat into the Pacific sky, generates strong high-altitude winds that sweep eastward across the Atlantic. And those winds arrive over the Atlantic hurricane nursery as wind shear. The El Niño, in effect, reaches across the hemisphere and fills the Atlantic with the one atmospheric condition that hurricanes cannot tolerate. It hostile-proofs the basin. Storms that try to organize there find the air working against them, tilting and tearing their structures before they can mature. Think about the strangeness of that connection for just a moment, because it is the kind of link that, once you see it, changes how you read the world. A pool of warm water displaced beneath the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of South America, ends up determining whether a storm can hold itself together over the open Atlantic, an entire ocean and a continent away. There is no direct contact. The Pacific water never touches the Atlantic storm. The connection is made entirely through the air, through the high-altitude winds that the surface Pacific heat sets in motion, winds that travel the width of a hemisphere and arrive over the Atlantic carrying the influence of an ocean they came from. This is what meteorologists mean by a teleconnection, an effect connected across an enormous distance with no obvious wire between the two ends. The wire is the atmosphere itself, and once you understand that the atmosphere is a single connected fluid wrapped around the whole planet, the teleconnection stops seeming mysterious and starts seeming inevitable. Of course, the Pacific can reach the Atlantic. They are both under the same sky. This is why the forecast models, anticipating this developing El Niño, are calling for a below-average Atlantic hurricane season in 2026. The numbers being discussed are in the range of 13 named storms, against a historical average closer to 15. Fewer storms than a typical year. And if you live anywhere along the Atlantic or Gulf Coast of the United States, I know exactly how that sentence sounds. It sounds like good news. It sounds like a quieter season, a year to exhale. I have to take that exhale away from you. Carefully, and with the data, but I have to take it away, because a lower storm count is one of the most dangerous pieces of good news in all of meteorology, and the reason is something forecasters understand well, and the public almost never hears. A seasonal forecast counts storms. It tallies how many named systems are likely to form across the whole basin over the whole season. But a storm count is an average, a basin-wide statistic, and you do not experience an average. You do not get hit by a seasonal total. You get hit if you get hit by one specific storm on one specific day at one specific stretch of coastline, and the wind shear that suppresses the overall count is concentrated out over the deep open Atlantic far from land, where most storms in an ordinary year would do their forming and their slow strengthening. Closer to home, it is a different story. The waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean, the warm water sitting right against the southern coastline of the United States, can remain exceptionally warm even in an El Niño year. The shear is offshore, the fuel is inshore, and that combination creates a specific and frightening kind of threat A storm does not have to travel across the whole, sheer hostile Atlantic to reach you. It can form close to home, in that warm Gulf or Caribbean water, almost on the doorstep of the coast. And a storm that forms close to shore is a storm that gives you very little warning, very little time, and very little distance over which to be tracked and understood before it arrives. It can spin up fast in hot water near land and be a serious hurricane in the time it would have taken a classic Atlantic storm to even get organised. History makes this point far more sharply than I can. Consider the year 1992. By the seasonal numbers, 1992 was a quiet Atlantic year, a low-count season, exactly the kind of year a forecast like the one we are discussing would describe. And 1992 produced Hurricane Andrew, a Category 5 storm that devastated South Florida and stands, decades later, as one of the most destructive hurricanes in American history. Consider 2018, also a year shaped by El Niño-leaning conditions, also not a high-count season, and 2018 produced Hurricane Michael, which struck the Florida Panhandle as a Category 5, a storm of almost unimaginable intensity. 2 quiet seasons by the count, 2 of the most violent landfalls the country has ever recorded. I want to dwell on Andrew for a moment, because the detail of it makes the point in a way a statistic cannot. Andrew was, for much of its early life, an unremarkable, even struggling system, the kind of disturbance a quiet season produces and forgets. And then it found the conditions it needed, and it intensified, rapidly, into a storm of catastrophic strength, and it came ashore in South Florida and rewrote the lives of everyone in its path, and, afterward, rewrote building codes and insurance, and the way an entire region prepared for storms. It was one storm. It came in a year the seasonal forecast had every reason to call quiet, and the people in its path did not experience a quiet season. They experienced Andrew. The seasonal number was true, and the seasonal number was, for them, completely irrelevant. That is the gap between a statistic and a life, and it is the gap that a reassuring hurricane forecast can fall straight into. And there is a particular cruelty in how this plays psychologically, which is worth naming directly. When people hear that a season is forecast to be below average, they do not just file that as a neutral fact. They relax. They defer the preparations, they put off the plan, they let the supplies run low, because the official word was quiet. So a low-count El Niño season can actually leave a coastline less ready than a normal season would, not more, because the forecast itself lowered everyone's guard. The storm that then forms in the warm Gulf water close to shore fast arrives at a coastline that was told to expect calm. The forecast did not lie. It simply described the basin and not the danger, and the human mind heard the word quiet and quietly stopped preparing. That is why I am spending this time on it. The single most dangerous thing about the hurricane fingerprint of a super El Niño is not the storms. It is the word quiet, and what that word does to the people who hear it. The lesson is one sentence long, and I want it to land. It only takes one. It only ever takes one storm finding the right water and the right moment to define a season and to change a coastline. A low number on a seasonal forecast tells you something true about the basin as a whole, and it tells you almost nothing about whether this is the year a Category 5 finds your stretch of shore. The forming El Niño in the Pacific will, in all likelihood, hold the Atlantic storm count down. It will not hold the danger down. It simply moves the danger closer to the coast and shortens the warning. And that is why the hurricane season is the first place the world will see this. Long before the winter weather chains we're about to trace, long before the global droughts and floods, the developing Super El Niño will quietly press its thumb on the Atlantic, and a strangely quiet, strangely close-to-home hurricane season will be the opening signature of the giant still rising in the Pacific. The first fingerprint. But only the first. Because as 2026 turns toward winter, that same heat reaches for the high-altitude rivers of air that run directly over North America, and the next thing it rewrites is the weather outside your own window. Part 6. The Winter. The jet stream was rebuilt. As 2026 turns toward winter, the atmospheric chain reaction that began with a pool of trapped Pacific heat shifts directly over North America, and to follow it there, we need to meet the single most important character in the winter half of this story. It is not a storm and it is not a front. It is a river of wind several miles above your head called the subtropical jet stream. The jet streams are fast and narrow currents of air that flow high in the atmosphere, ribbons of wind that wrap around the planet and act as the great steering tracks of weather. Storms do not wander at random. They are largely guided, carried, and energized by these high-altitude rivers. And the position and strength of those rivers is not fixed. It responds to where the heat is. The jet streams exist fundamentally because of temperature differences in the atmosphere, and when you dump a giant new source of heat into the tropical Pacific, you change those temperature differences and the rivers respond. It is worth understanding why a jet stream exists at all, because once you do, the El Niño connection becomes obvious rather than mysterious. A jet stream forms along a boundary, a zone where warmer air and colder air meet, and the sharper that temperature contrast, the faster the river of wind that runs along it. So the jet stream is, in effect, a wind generated by a temperature difference. Now, a super El Niño is, fundamentally, a giant new pile of heat dropped into the tropical Pacific. It changes the temperature contrast between the tropics and the regions to the north of them. It changes the very thing that the jet stream is built from, so it should not surprise you at all that dumping a historic quantity of heat into the tropical Pacific reaches up and reshapes the jet stream. The jet stream was always a creature of temperature contrasts, and the El Niño is, at its core, a temperature event. The one was always going to move the other. The energized, southward shifted subtropical jet of an El Niño winter is not a coincidence riding alongside the warm water. It is the direct physical downstream consequence of it. During a super El Niño, the subtropical jet stream, the more southern of these rivers of air, does two things. It becomes highly energized, faster and stronger, fed by all that surfaced Pacific heat, and it shifts. It dips southward, sagging down so that it runs directly across the southern tier of the United States, a region it does not always dominate. So picture what has happened. You have taken one of the planet's main weather steering tracks, you have made it faster and more powerful than usual, and you have repositioned it so that it aims straight across the southern half of the country. You have in effect rebuilt the conveyor belt and pointed it at North America, and that conveyor belt is now loaded with cargo, because the energized jet stream tracks right across the warm Pacific and picks up an enormous load of moisture on its way. So the west coast of the United States, and California in particular, finds itself at the receiving end of a fast, powerful, moisture-laden river of air aimed directly at it. The result is a high probability of frequent and intense atmospheric rivers. An atmospheric river is exactly what the name suggests. A long, narrow corridor of concentrated water vapor in the sky. A literal river of airborne moisture that, when it slams into the mountains of the west coast, wrings itself out as torrential rain and mountain snow. Now, for a California that has lived through punishing drought, rain sounds like salvation, and in part it is. These atmospheric rivers can be genuinely drought-busting. They can refill reservoirs and rebuild a snowpack in weeks. But there is a hard edge to it, and the models see it clearly. The sheer volume of water that a super El Niño can deliver through these repeated atmospheric rivers is not gentle, drought-relieving rain spread kindly across a season. It can be too much, too fast, arriving on terrain that cannot absorb it, and that sharply raises the risk of severe flooding, of rivers overtopping their banks, of saturated hillsides giving way as mudslides and debris flows. It is the cruel arithmetic of a drought broken too violently. The same conveyor belt that ends the dryness can, in the same winter, deliver the flood, and there is a specific mechanism behind why drought broken by flood is so dangerous, and it deserves explaining, because it is not obvious. You might think land that has been thirsty for years would be especially good at absorbing rain when it finally comes. The opposite is often true. Soil that has been baked hard and dry through a long drought can become almost water repellent at the surface, so that the first heavy rains do not soak in. They run off, sheeting across the hard ground instead of being absorbed by it, and in places where drought has been followed by wildfire, and large parts of the West have seen exactly that sequence, the burned ground is even more hostile to water, the soil chemically altered by the heat, into something that sheds rain rather than drinking it. So you have an atmospheric river, a fire hose of Pacific moisture, aimed at terrain that has been primed by drought and fire to reject water rather than absorb it. The rain arrives, the ground refuses it, and the water does the only thing it can, which is to gather and rush downhill. carrying soil and rock and the burned remains of hillsides with it. That is the debris flow. That is the mudslide. And that is why the very same winter that refills the reservoirs can also be the winter that buries a road or a neighbourhood. The drought does not simply end. It hands off, violently, to its opposite. Follow the conveyor belt eastward. As that energised jet stream tracks on across the country, it carries beneficial, generally welcome rain into Texas and across the Gulf Coast. A wetter, milder pattern for that part of the country. But keep following it, because where it goes next is where the winter story turns dangerous again. When that moisture-laden, energised southern jet stream reaches the southeast, and Florida in particular, it runs into something. It meets a much warmer, more humid air mass sitting over the Gulf and the southeast. And you now know from everything we built in the hurricane section, what happens when you force fast-moving air to interact with warm, humid, unstable air. You get the ingredients for severe weather. This is why strong El Niño winters have a well-documented and genuinely unsettling signature across the American South. They tend to generate a volatile, active, severe weather season in the cool half of the year, elevating the risk of tornadoes and damaging winds across the southeast through the late autumn, the winter, and into the early spring, a stretch running roughly from November all the way through March. Think about how wrong that feels against the calendar. We are conditioned to file tornadoes under spring, under a specific and limited season. A super El Niño can keep the threat switched on through the depths of winter, in months when the public has every reason to believe that danger is in storage. An energised jet stream and a warm, humid southeast is a recipe for severe weather in January. That is the kind of seasonal wrongness this event specialises in. And the calendar problem is not a small thing, it is a genuine danger multiplier. Because so much of how we stay safe from severe weather is built on the calendar. Communities in the South run their preparedness on a rhythm. Spring is when you check the plan, when the awareness campaigns run, when people remember where the safe room is and keep an eye on the forecast. Winter, in the public mind, is for a different set of worries. It is not tornado time. So when a super El Niño reaches in and runs a volatile severe weather season straight through December and January, it is not only producing storms, it is producing storms in the window when the human guard is lowest, when the seasonal alertness has been switched off, when a family hears a watch issued in the middle of winter and some part of their mind files it as surely a mistake, surely not now. The storm does not care what month it is, but we do, and that mismatch between when the danger actually comes and when we are psychologically braced for it is one of the quietest and most underappreciated hazards in this entire chain. The energised jet stream does not just move the storms, it moves them out of the season we are watching for them. And then, to complete the North American picture, look to the opposite corner of the map. While the southern tier is being raked by an energised, moisture-loaded jet stream, the northern tier of the United States, the Pacific Northwest, and much of Canada tend to experience the mirror image. With the storm track pulled south, the north is left out of it. Those regions typically see a notably drier and warmer than average winter. Less snow, milder temperatures, a quieter and more subdued cold season. One single displaced pool of Pacific heat, and the United States is effectively split in two, a wet, stormy, dangerous southern half and a dry, mild, snow-starved northern half, with the energised jet stream drawn like a line between them. And I want to be careful here, because a mild, dry winter sounds, on its face, like the easy option, the corner of the map that got lucky. For day-to-day comfort, perhaps it is, but a dry northern winter carries its own quieter bill, and it comes due later. Across the northern tier and the mountain west, the winter snowpack is not just weather. It is storage. It is the reservoir that holds the water through the cold months and then releases it slowly through the spring and summer melt, feeding the rivers and the soil and the supply that whole regions depend on through the dry season. A winter that runs warm and snow-starved is a winter that fails to fill that storage. And so a mild El Niño winter in the north can hand off, months later, to a summer of low rivers, stressed water supplies, and dried-out landscapes primed for fire. The pleasant winter and the difficult summer are the same event separated by a season. So even the lucky corner of the map is not truly exempt. The displaced Pacific heat reaches it too. It simply collects its toll on a delay. There is a larger point hiding inside that split-in-two map, and it is one of the most important ideas in this entire video, so I want to say it plainly. A super El Niño is not a disaster in the ordinary sense of the word. It is not uniformly bad everywhere. It is a redistribution. It takes the planet's heat and moisture and it moves them, and wherever you stand, the question is not simply is this bad, it is what did the redistribution do to my particular place. For drought-stricken California, the rain is, in part, a genuine reprieve. For the Gulf Coast, the beneficial rains are welcome. For the snow-starved north, the mild winter is, at least at first, pleasant. The danger of a super El Niño is not that it is a single uniform catastrophe. The danger is that it is a violent reshuffling, and a violent reshuffling produces extremes at every position on the board, floods where there was drought, drought where there was rain, storms out of season, calm where storms were needed. It is not the badness that should alarm you. It is the sheer scale of the rearrangement, and the fact that one pool of hidden water is the hand doing the rearranging. The effects do not even stop at the Atlantic shoreline. Across the ocean, in the United Kingdom and across northern Europe, El Niño tends to tilt the odds toward colder and drier conditions in the later part of winter. Though I will be honest that the European signal is more variable and less dependable than the North American one. But the broad point holds, and it is the point this entire video has been building toward. We are no longer talking about a quirk in a distant ocean. We are talking about the rain on the hills above Los Angeles, the tornado risk over Florida in January, the missing snow across the northern states and Canada, the texture of winter itself for hundreds of millions of people. All of it traceable, link by link, back to a pool of warm water that is, as you watch this, still hidden beneath the surface of the Pacific. That hidden heat wave, the one we opened this video with, is the thing now poised to reach up and rewrite the weather outside your own window. Part 7. The Far Side of the World. It would be a mistake to leave you with the impression that this is fundamentally a North American story that happens to have a Pacific cause. It is not. The Earth is a single connected system, one atmosphere and one set of linked oceans, and a disturbance large enough to rewrite a North American winter is, by absolute necessity, large enough to rewrite the weather of the entire planet at the same time. So before we reach the final and larger scale of this story, I want to take you to the far side of the world, to see what the same pool of displaced heat is doing to lands most of this audience will never visit. Return, first, to where the surfacing warm water actually arrives, the coast of South America. We have already seen the oceanic blow it delivers there, the warm cap shutting down the cold upwelling and starving that extraordinarily rich fishery. The marine consequence is severe and it is swift. The food web that the upwelling supported, the explosion of microscopic life that fed the fish that fed everything else, loses its foundation, and fish populations along the Peruvian and Ecuadorian coast can collapse for the duration of the event. For communities whose entire economy is built on that sea, an El Niño is not an abstraction on a climate index. It is the year the catch did not come, and the damage there does not stop at the fish. Remember the chain we built in the early parts of this video. Cold water rises, nutrients rise with it, microscopic plant life explodes, small fish feed on it, larger animals feed on the small fish. When the warm cap shuts the upwelling off, that whole chain loses its base, and the loss travels upward through every level of it. The seabirds that nested in vast colonies along that coast, dependent on the fish, can suffer catastrophic breeding failures. Marine mammals can starve. An El Niño can empty a stretch of coastline of life that, months earlier, had been one of the most crowded ecosystems on the planet, and the recovery, when the cold water finally returns, can take years rather than months. So when we talk about the upwelling shutting down, understand that we are not talking about an inconvenience to fishermen. We are talking about the temporary collapse of an entire living system, top to bottom, because the single physical input that the whole system was built on, the rising of cold, nutrient-rich water, has been switched off by a cap of warm water that drifted in from the other side of the ocean. But the atmospheric blow to South America arrives right alongside the oceanic one. All that warm surface water now sitting against the western coast of the continent is, just as it was in the central Pacific, venting heat and moisture into the sky. And that drives heavy, sustained rainfall over the normally dry western coastal regions of Peru, Ecuador and northern Chile. These are lands whose landscapes and towns are shaped by the expectation of dryness, and an El Niño can deliver them months of punishing rain, with a high risk of severe flooding, of rivers reborn in deserts, of infrastructure simply never built for water on that scale. And here the atmosphere does something that reveals, more than almost anything else in this story, how interconnected and how counterintuitive the system truly is. At the very same time that the western coast of South America is drowning, the shift in atmospheric circulation can reach inland and push the Amazon basin, the largest rainforest on Earth, towards severe drought. Sit with that. The same single event, the same pool of displaced Pacific heat, can flood the Peruvian coast and dry out the Amazon in the same season, drowning and drought side by side on the same continent, both signed by the same hand. That is the reach of this thing. That is what people mean, in the most literal way, when they say the climate system is connected. And the Amazon is not just any forest to lose moisture, which is why this particular link in the chain should trouble you more than it first appears. The Amazon is a forest that, to a remarkable degree, makes its own rain. Moisture rises off the trees, forms cloud, falls again as rain, and is taken up and lifted again by the next stretch of forest, a cycle of water recycled across the basin many times before it ever leaves. The rainforest is not a passive recipient of rain, it is an active participant in producing it, which means a forest pushed into drought is a forest with a weakened ability to generate its own moisture, and a weakened moisture cycle deepens the drought, and the deepening drought weakens the cycle further. It is, like so much in this story, a loop that can feed on itself. A super El Niño leaning on the Amazon is not just withholding rain from it for a season. It is leaning on a system that, once pushed hard enough, can begin to dry itself out from the inside. The same connectedness that lets one Pacific warm pool reach an entire planet is the connectedness that lets a single dry season reach deep into the machinery of the largest rainforest on Earth. Now cross the entire ocean, back to where this whole story began, to the Western Pacific, to Indonesia and Australia. Remember the warm pool. Remember that for years it sat piled against that western side of the ocean, and remember what sits with warm water. The clouds, the rising air, the reliable rainfall. The Western Pacific was wet because the warm pool lived there, but in an El Niño that warm pool has slid east toward the Americas. It has left home. And when the warm surface water departs the Western Pacific, the storm clouds and the rising air that travelled with it depart too. They follow the heat east. What gets left behind in the Western Pacific is cooler water and stable, sinking air, and sinking air does not make rain. So Australia, in a strong El Niño, is left exposed to widespread drought. The reliable wet patterns falter. The moisture that the continent depends on simply sets up somewhere else, thousands of miles away over a different ocean. And an Australia starved of that moisture, an Australia whose vegetation dries while the continent's naturally fierce heat bears down on it, is an Australia facing a sharply elevated risk of severe, fast-moving, catastrophic wildfire. The same displaced pool of heat that floods a desert in Peru can, on the far side of the Pacific, prime a continent to burn. And the Australian fire risk has a particular and frightening structure to it that is worth spelling out, because it is the same drought-to-fire logic we saw threatening the American West, only running on a different continent off the same Pacific trigger. A wet year in Australia is not purely good news for the fire season that follows, because a wet year grows grass and scrub, it puts fuel on the landscape. Then the El Niño arrives, the rains fail, and all that vegetation cures dries out, turns from living plant into standing fuel. Now add the continent's own ferocious natural heat, pressing down on a landscape carpeted with dried fuel, and you have built, step by step, the conditions for fire on a scale that can outrun any human ability to fight it. The El Niño does not light the match. It does something more fundamental and more dangerous. It prepares the ground so thoroughly that almost any match will do. And once again, notice the through line of this entire video. It is the same pool of water, it floods one coast, it dries a rainforest, it primes a continent to burn, and it does all of it at once, because the atmosphere carrying its consequences is one single connected fluid wrapped around one single planet. I want you to hold the whole map in your mind for a moment, because this is the moment the scale of it should truly land. One pool of warm water currently hidden beneath the Pacific. From that single source, flooding rains and a volatile tornado season across the American South, atmospheric rivers and mudslides in California, a dry, snow-starved winter across the northern states and Canada, a strangely quiet but dangerously close hurricane season in the Atlantic, flooding on the Peruvian coast, drought in the Amazon, drought and catastrophic fire risk across Australia. Every one of those, every single one, is the same heat surfacing and spreading, and being carried by one connected atmosphere into every corner of the globe. This is not a list of unrelated disasters. It is one event wearing many faces, and you can trace every face back to that quiet, invisible warm pool we started with. And once you can see it whole, once you can hold that entire connected picture in your head at once, there is one last question waiting, and it is the largest one of all. If a single El Niño can do all of this, can reach every continent and rewrite a year of weather across the whole planet at once, then what does it do to the temperature of the planet itself? Part 8. The year the planet ran a fever. To answer that question, I want to return to the simplest and most fundamental description of what an El Niño actually is, the description we started with, because everything in this final part flows from it. An El Niño is a transfer of heat. That is the deepest truth of the entire phenomenon. It is the ocean, the planet's great reservoir of stored thermal energy, taking a vast quantity of heat that had been held inside the water and handing it over to the atmosphere. For most of the time, the ocean is a vault. It absorbs heat, it stores heat, it locks an enormous amount of the planet's excess energy away beneath its surface, where it does not warm the air we live in. The deep, trapped warm pool we have been tracking through this entire video is, in a sense, exactly that. The vault doing its job, heat held out of the atmosphere. But an El Niño is the vault opening. It is the moment a large share of that stored heat is released from the water and delivered into the air, and the air does not keep that heat in one place. The winds, the same global circulation we have followed across continents, take that released heat and spread it through the whole atmosphere of the planet. And when you release a large quantity of stored heat from the ocean into the atmosphere and spread it around, you do something measurable and unavoidable. You raise the baseline temperature of the entire planet, not permanently, not as a new fixed state, but temporarily. For the span of the event and the year that follows it, you lift the average temperature of the whole Earth. A super El Niño functions, in effect, as a planetary thermostat being nudged upward. The Earth, for a year or so, runs a fever. This is not speculation. It is one of the most well-established patterns in all of climate science, and you can see it in the historical record with your own eyes. The hottest individual years humanity has ever recorded tend to cluster, with a striking regularity, around major El Niño events. The big El Niño feeds its released ocean heat into the global average, and the thermometer for the whole planet jumps. The monster event of 2015 was followed by a global temperature record. The pattern is dependable enough that climate scientists looking ahead can say something genuinely remarkable. Based on the subsurface ocean data we can measure right now, based on the sheer quantity of heat already loaded into that hidden Pacific warm pool, the thermodynamics point to a clear and sobering probability. If this event surfaces and grows the way the deep ocean data suggests it can, then 2027 carries a high probability of becoming the warmest year in the entire recorded history of the planet. There is a subtlety in that timing that I want to make sure you catch, because it explains something people often find confusing. The peak of an El Niño and the peak of its effect on global temperature do not happen at the same moment. The event itself tends to crest around the turn of the year, but the planet's temperature response lags behind it, because it takes time for all that released ocean heat to work its way fully through the atmosphere and register in the global average. So an El Niño that peaks late in 2026 delivers its biggest punch to the global thermometer in the year that follows, in 2027. The heat is loaded now, it surfaces over the coming months, it crests around the new year. And then it spends the year after that pushing the temperature of the whole planet upward. That is the chain of timing behind the projection. It is also, in a way, the final and largest expression of the central idea of this entire video, the lag between a cause and its consequence. We have watched that lag at the scale of a hidden wave crossing an ocean. Here it is again at the scale of an entire planet's temperature. The hottest year potentially already set in motion by heat, already in the water, simply waiting out the months it takes to arrive. Let me hold that sentence still for a moment. Because of everything in this video, it is the one I most want you to carry out of it. The warmest year ever recorded may already, in a sense, be decided. Not by something that will happen, but by something that has already happened. by heat that is already in the water, already pooled, already measured by instruments in the sea. The hottest year in human record-keeping could already be loaded into the system, simply waiting beneath the surface for its turn to rise, and that thought returns us, one final time, to the gap that this whole video has lived inside, the gap between a calm surface and an alarmed projection. We are not waiting for the heat to be created, we are waiting for heat that already exists to come up for air. Now, before we close, intellectual honesty requires me to do something this channel always does, which is to take seriously the alternative explanations, the theories that circulate whenever a story like this gets attention, and to look at them squarely rather than pretend they do not exist. The first, and the one you will encounter most often, is the idea that an event like this is not natural at all, that a forming super El Niño is somehow being engineered, manufactured, deliberately induced by human beings through some form of weather modification. And I understand the instinct behind that belief. When something this large and this consequential is bearing down on us, the idea that someone, somewhere is in control of it can feel strangely less frightening than the truth. But the theory collapses the moment you weigh it against the actual physics, and the deciding factor is energy. Think back to everything we have established about scale. An El Niño is the movement and release of a quantity of heat so vast that it shifts the temperature of a meaningful fraction of the largest ocean on the planet and raises the temperature of the entire Earth. The total energy involved is simply astronomical. Now set every tool of so-called weather modification that humans actually possess against that number. Cloud seeding, the real and genuine technology, can encourage an already existing cloud to release a little more of its rain than it otherwise would. A nudge of a few percent to a system that nature already built. It cannot create a cloud, and it most certainly cannot move an ocean. There is no human technology, not cloud seeding, not any facility that heats the upper atmosphere, not aircraft, that operates within many, many orders of magnitude of the energy required to weaken a planetary wind system and slide the warm pool of the Pacific eastward. We are not talking about a technology gap that clever engineering might close. We are talking about a mismatch so enormous that the comparison is not even meaningful. The El Niño is not engineered. Nothing we have built comes within an unimaginable distance of being able to engineer it. And let me add one more thing to the weather modification question, because the believers in it often have a follow-up, and a fair channel answers the follow-up rather than dodging it. The follow-up is, but governments have admitted to weather modification research, cloud seeding programs are real and documented, so why is it crazy to think the bigger version exists too? And the answer is that the real thing and the imagined thing are separated by a gulf so vast it is hard to communicate. Yes, cloud seeding is real, it is also tiny, it works only on clouds that already exist, and it nudges their output by a modest amount under favourable conditions. The honest scientific position has never been that humans cannot influence weather at all. It is that the influence we can actually exert is local, marginal, and dependent on nature having already done the heavy lifting. Reversing a hemisphere-spanning wind system and relocating the warm pool of the largest ocean on Earth is not a bigger version of cloud seeding. It is a different category of action entirely. The way lifting a pebble and lifting a mountain range are not 2 points on the same scale. The existence of the pebble lifting does not make the mountain lifting plausible. It just proves we can lift pebbles. The second theory runs in the opposite direction. It says the models are exaggerating, that the 3-degree projection is alarmism, that forecasters inflate these things to capture attention. And here I want to be genuinely fair because there is a real and reasonable kernel inside that skepticism, and I have already handed it to you myself. The 3-degree figure is a projection, and projections carry uncertainty, and spring forecasts of these events have been wrong before. If someone wants to be cautious about that specific number, they are not being foolish, they are being appropriately careful. But notice the precise boundary of that caution. The projection is uncertain. The subsurface warm pool is not. The 5 to 6 degree heat anomaly at depth is not a forecast and not a model output. It is a measurement taken by physical instruments of heat that physically exists in the ocean right now. So the honest position is not to dismiss the story, and it is not to panic over the worst number. The honest position is to separate the two things. The engine is measured and real. The exact size of the eventual bang is the part still being estimated. You are allowed to doubt the estimate. You're not, looking at the buoy data, allowed to doubt the engine. There is also a worthwhile point to make about why models, even uncertain ones, deserve more respect than the word model tends to get in casual conversation. People sometimes say it is just a model, as though that settles the matter, as though a model were a guess dressed up in numbers. But a climate model is not a guess. It is the known laws of physics, the same physics that governs a falling apple and a boiling kettle, applied to a vast grid of the ocean and atmosphere and run forward in time. When several independent models built by different teams fed the same observed subsurface heat, all converge on the same alarming trajectory, that convergence is not a coincidence, and it is not groupthink. It is multiple independent applications of physics arriving at the same answer because the physics points there. That does not make the projection certain. Nothing about the future is certain, but it does mean the projection is the considered output of our best physical understanding, not a number invented to frighten you. Skepticism of the precise figure is healthy. Contempt for the entire enterprise of modelling is not skepticism. It is just refusing to look at the most powerful tool we have for seeing what is coming. And the third idea is the gentlest of the three, and the closest to being simply true. It says, El Niño is a natural cycle. It has happened for thousands of years, long before humans could have influenced anything. So there is nothing unusual here and nothing to be concerned about. And the first half of that is correct. El Niño is natural. It is an ancient rhythm of the ocean and the atmosphere, and it will go on long after every current headline is forgotten. But the conclusion does not follow from the premise. The thing that makes this particular event worth your attention is not that the cycle exists. It is the projected magnitude of this specific turn of the cycle, potentially the strongest in well over a century, and the fact that it would be arriving on top of a planet whose baseline temperature is already elevated above where it sat during any previous comparable event. A natural cycle and a record-breaking outcome are not opposites. This event can be entirely natural in its mechanism and still, because of the height of the floor it is rising from, deliver a result the modern record has never seen. Natural does not mean small. Natural does not mean safe. So let us stand back now and look at the whole thing one last time, all of it at once. There is, at this moment, a heatwave forming in the Pacific Ocean. Not in the air, where you could feel it, but roughly 100 meters beneath the surface, in a vast pool of trapped water running 5 to 6 degrees above where it belongs. The surface of the sea above it looks calm. The official index still reads close to neutral. By the strict definition, the thing has not yet begun. And yet the engine is fully loaded, the deep wave is already in motion, and the supercomputer models, reading that measured subsurface heat, are projecting an event beyond anything in well over 100 years, an event that would suppress a hurricane season while sharpening its danger, rebuild the jet stream over North America, flood one coast of South America while drying its rainforest, prime a continent to burn, and very possibly carry the entire planet to the warmest year it has ever recorded. All of it, every consequence, traceable to that one quiet, invisible pool of warm water. We began this video with a simple, strange fact that the most consequential climate event now bearing down on the world is one that almost nobody can see, because it is hiding underwater. And we end it with the same fact, but I hope it lands differently now. When you first heard it, 2 hours ago, it was just a curious claim, a heat wave you cannot see. Now you know what every word of it means. You know what the heat wave is, a pool of trapped water 5 to 6 degrees too warm. You know where it is, roughly 100 meters down in the equatorial Pacific. You know why you cannot see it, because the surface is the last layer to feel the heat rise. You know how it got there, the trade winds and the warm pool and the tilted thermocline. You know what releases it, the weakening wind and the patient pull of gravity. And you know what it does once it surfaces, every link of it, from the Atlantic hurricanes to the rebuilt jet stream to the floods and droughts on the far side of the world. The strange claim has become a machine you can see in full, and a machine you can see is a machine you can reason about, instead of simply fearing. Because now you understand the machine, now you know that the calm of that surface is not safety, it is delay. The heat is real, it is measured, it is already here, and it is already moving. The only thing the ocean has not done yet is let us see it. So the real question is not whether this heat wave is coming. It is already coming. The question is the one we've circled from the very first minute, and now it is yours to sit with. When all of that hidden heat finally finishes its long climb to the surface and the calm at last breaks, will the warning the models gave us turn out to have been the gift that it was, or just the part of the story we watched and understood and still were not ready for?